So I'm going to cover over the next 20 minutes or so some information about how to write a successful funding application for a trial. And I'll pick up on quite a lot of the themes that have already been covered by Michael, by Natasha, by Svetlana, and earlier by James. So this slide is really an overview of everything that we think of when crafting a research proposal. And I'm hopefully going to cover most of these points over the next 20 minutes. But this slide shows the importance of and the various elements that go in to crafting and writing a robust research proposal. And I think there's really some key considerations in there. So the trial itself, or the study and the design of that, building an appropriate team around a proposal, involving patients, that's the critical element to trials and research generally, identifying appropriate funders for the research, for the trial or study that you're planning, identifying actually what is required to run your study so that you can ask the funder for the appropriate amount of resource. Thinking about the narrative, what are you trying to say in your application? We know that those who review applications don't do so with lots of leisurely time on their hands. They're reviewing these quickly and getting the right messages across early in your application and in the right manner is a really important element. And then more broadly, who to involve in developing a research proposal in terms of sponsorship, insurance, other elements that you need to think about in a fairly timely manner. So in terms of the trial and design, this is a critical element, as you can imagine, to getting a proposal right. So thinking about the methodology that you're going to use. And I won't dwell too much on this, but there's lots of elements to here, many of which were covered by Michael earlier in terms of cancer trials and certainly early phase trials. So when you're doing a randomized trial, are you doing a non-randomized trial? Is it going to be looking at innovative or adaptive designs? Are you looking at, if you're doing a randomized trial, whether it's superiority, whether your intervention is going to be better, whether it's going to be a non-inferiority trial, so no worse than the current standard of care. Thinking also about trial outcomes, so what's the primary thing that you're interested in, what's the primary research question, what you're trying to answer, and then how are you going to actually measure that outcome? So what tool are you going to use to assess that outcome? An important part of this is the timing of those assessments. So thinking through when you're going to assess that particular or those particular outcomes. And then thinking more broadly about the trial and the design, about whether there's other elements that need to be brought in. So is there also a question around cost effectiveness? And certainly if you were looking at an HTA level grant, where it's often a late stage design, you might be looking at clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness, at which point you would need to bring in the requisite skills, so a health economics team. Also thinking through whether there might be any mixed methods or qualitative questions or questions in there that might be best answered using a mixed methods approach. And of course, all of this needs to be led by what it is that you're trying to answer. What's the research question? And importantly, what's gone on before? So what's the literature saying? What's the data that you've got to date saying? And that helps to drive the trial and the trial design. So important to have a strong team. We know that really good research doesn't always get funded, and sometimes that's to do with all the different elements, but around having a robust research team that can show to a funder that they will be able to develop and deliver on a trial. So things that you would be thinking about are the seniority and the track record of the principal investigator, making sure that they've got they've got some experience in the area, potentially of leading trials previously? And if not, is there a mechanism, is there someone that's maybe more senior that could come in to help mentor and support that principal investigator? It doesn't take much when you hear Michael speak earlier to understand the importance of statistical collaboration and ensuring that that collaboration is established early to give the trial the time to be developed properly before it goes to a funder. It may be that what you're planning requires the expertise of a clinical trials unit, so an academic clinical trials unit, such as Newcastle, where we're all based, but there are a network of clinical trials units nationally. You must also be thinking about the track record and the experience generally of the team and making sure that you've got the requisite experience and expertise within that team for all the different elements. So for example, if you're thinking of doing a cost effectiveness analysis, the expectation would be that there would need to be a health economist within the team. If you've got a qualitative element, again, you would need to ensure that you included a qualitative researcher within your research team. I'm going to talk a little bit more about patient and public involvement on the next page, on the next slide, but it's an absolute critical element that you have involved patients in your development of your project, in development of the design, and in some cases as a member of the research team themselves. So a number of funders now are encouraging co-applicants who are members of the public, who are patients, and there does need to be some careful consideration about what role they'll play within the research team, but it is becoming increasingly common. And it's also important to make sure that you've got a well-balanced team. You need leadership from a principal investigator, but sometimes you need to think about perhaps not having too many chiefs. So I mentioned patients there. I think that there's almost none of those funders that have been described by Svetlana and Natasha who wouldn't expect to have patients actively involved in the trial design and also throughout the trial life cycle. So right through from the design stage to actually some of the running of a study and also in the dissemination. And these are the questions that if you were going to one of the NIHR panels, they might be asking in the application form. So where have patients been actively involved and how have they been actively involved and what have those conversations brought to the design? So quite often, and we do this a lot within the Sir Bobby Robson group, we'll have an idea for a trial and then we'll go and speak to patients, and that will really help to craft some of the ways in which the trial will be run. We also would encourage patients to be involved in oversight committees for trials, and we know that this allows us to always focus the research on patients and to ensure that the sort of very heart of what we do is reflected in the needs of patients. I think it's fair to say that if you didn't have plans for active involvement, you'd need to explain it very carefully, but I think that most committees would just simply expect that patients are involved actively in research. James and I are also involved in a national initiative called the NIHR Include project, and I've put the link in here, and it's something that's going to be increasingly apparent across funders. The guidance that we have drafted there has now been adopted by the Wellcome Trust. It's now included in NIHR applications and also with the HRA who provide ethical approval for studies that have been funded. And it's around ensuring that we look very carefully at underserved groups in research and thinking every element, every stage of the design process and during a study or trial where we can include the widest possible sphere of patients and to ensure that we're not excluding patients for any reason. So For example, you might find that people in rural areas, in the particular group of patients you're looking at, typically don't take part in trials. But by including funding for them to actually attend hospital, you've included them, and you've enabled them to take part in research. It may be that you do a lot of research and you exclude patients on the basis that they don't speak English, but actually you've got your primary outcome doesn't require maybe patients to speak English. So you might be able to include those patients by doing some translation for these or secondary outcomes, or excluding them from secondary outcomes, but not fundamentally affecting your main trial. So it's very context specific, but it's a really important part that you look very carefully at the trial you've designed, the population you're trying to include in your trial, and ensuring that that is as inclusive as possible right from the get-go. And the encouraging thing is funders are now including this in guidelines, so where there are costs associated with that, they will pay. I'm not going to dwell too much on choosing the right funder. I know Natasha and Svetlana have covered this, but it's important that you do match the funder to the question and to the research project that is being planned, and making sure that you do look at the information that's available. There's obviously a number of websites that we've included today. Have a look at maybe things they've funded previously. A lot of funders run webinars, and it's worth attending these to understand whether your project is likely to fit with funder remits. And don't be afraid to ask questions if it's not clear. I myself am involved in a meeting with EMI in a few weeks' time where we're simply not clear if they'll fund, if they're likely to fund a particular project. And so we've requested a meeting with the programme manager to make sure that we're on the right page before we go any further with development of a particular project. And I think you need to be prepared that sometimes funder expectations don't necessarily match the design and the proposal you've put together. Some of them might have expectations around the timeline. So for example, RFPB, the expectation is that that project would be finished within 3 years. And so sometimes projects do need to be adjusted to fit with funder expectations, or you may need to go and have a look at other funders. When you're writing a proposal, you also need to think very carefully about who the audience is, who's going to review that proposal. So invariably on panels, you will have the content experts. So they may be clinical, they're often referees, and they will also be on the panel. You will also have experienced researchers who aren't content experts, and they also may have a particular interest in the methodology, and they're most likely to be members of the actual funding panel. And there are often PPI representatives on funder panels. So it's very important that you understand the makeup of the people who will review an application, and to write for all of those groups. And then to start thinking about the story that you're trying to tell. So I've split this down into importance, success, value, and then competence, and I'll go through each of these in turn. So thinking about the importance of the question, and this is to patients, to clinicians, to the public, and of course to the funder. Why is it that they are the right funder for this particular research question? And you're really wanting to be able to sell an understanding of the scale and the burden of the particular challenge or clinical issue that you're trying to address. Success. So being able to clearly demonstrate that what you are proposing within your trial is going to answer this very important research question. So that's making sure that the methods that you are choosing, your trial design, is appropriate for that question. There's a value for money question or element to this, making sure that you demonstrate value for money. And this is maybe a little bit nebulous. It's not so easy to pin down what value is. And it goes without saying that almost without fail, what you put into a funder, they will ask you to justify and check that is the value, the funding needed. But it is important that you think through all the elements of the budget and provide a value for money offer for the project in question. And then it's also important to demonstrate that within this team, you are best placed, you are the best placed team to actually deliver this particular project, and that you have undertaken some element of feasibility work to ensure that actually the trial will run and will complete. There are unfortunately trials that don't complete, so any funder will want to know that this team can deliver this trial. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about how you might convey this story and the opportunities that you've got. So clearly you've got the title. I know it sounds silly to say the title of a project, but actually you can put so much information into the title of your trial. And actually it's a really great place to set the scene for what you are planning on doing within your particular proposal. Thinking carefully about the background, we often have quite restrained space within an application form, but it is important that you show you've had a thorough look at all the existing evidence, so both the primary literature, any systematic reviews, any policy documents, guidance documents, existing data sets, audits, everything that's out there, to make sure that you comprehensively develop this background section. And it's going to be important that you acknowledge what's happened to date and potentially any limitations to that, so that you can demonstrate that what you're planning within your proposal is the next logical step. So the example I'll give is I'm planning quite a large trial. We're putting it into the funder in March, and there's actually been an equivalent large trial in another area, but the equivalent, the previously completed trial included over 99% of males, but we know that actually the population is roughly 60% female, and actually their outcomes are substantially different. So we know that generally women have different outcomes to males. So that's part of our argument for why we need to do the trial that we're planning. So it's important to be really, really clear about what the problem is that you're trying to address, both to patients, clinicians, and to the NHS and funder, and what the impact of this problem is actually having right now. I've mentioned how, or demonstrating how the proposed trial will actually fill the evidence gap, and making sure that you aren't taking 10 steps when actually you need to, it's about the next logical step in a pathway to impact. You need to be very careful that the trial that there is actually a time when trials should happen, and that the trial is needed now. And some of this will be having a thorough understanding of maybe other trials that are related, that are ongoing, because sometimes it may be that the timing's not right if actually definitive results or other results from another trial may impact what you're planning. And you also need to be very, very clear about the timescale for impact of the research you're planning. We talk a lot about impact. The NIH are very, very keen on understanding impact. It's really risen up through funder expectations, I think, over the last couple of years. So being clear about what impact is and how, or the time frame for it, is important. Being very clear in your project plan about all the aims and objectives of what you're doing, the methods which we've discussed already, and thinking about the population that will be included. I spoke a little bit about include earlier, and making sure that you aren't unnecessarily excluding anyone from that population. And also thinking through the actual intervention itself and what you might be comparing it to, being clear about what that is, and we actually do see a number of proposals where it's still not quite clear what the intervention is when written down, and being very clear about that is important. And finally, thinking through all the other elements, the governance, so how will the trial run, any ethical concerns, regulatory elements, so does the MHRA need to be involved, for example? Is it a medical device? Who's going to then manage the trial? And then the timelines for a trial, and being really realistic about those. I mentioned the budget. And this is certainly something that takes a lot longer to sort out than you ever might imagine. And funders do look very, very closely at a budget. Invariably at an outline stage of an application, you might have just a requirement for a total figure, but it's very difficult to then alter too much from that figure when you have to provide a full breakdown of costs at the main stage. So it's important that you spend the time, even at outline, developing that full budget. So I think it's worth working with various teams within your research team, within your organisation, to understand all the different elements that are going to be need to be funded. And it's also worth mentioning that funders don't fund everything that you might think. So there are certain elements such as treatment costs that may not be funded by the actual funder. And there's some guidelines that have been developed nationally, and I put a link to them here, which describes clearly what they will and won't fund. And then of course there might need to be some negotiation with your NHS trust to understand what where funding might come, for example, for treatment costs. Feasibility. I think it's almost all funders will require you to provide evidence of feasibility, and it does require quite a lot of time. So, for example, feasibility, I would say, comes under these broad headings. So are the patients that you anticipate including in your trial actually there? Do they exist? Do they exist at the centres that you want to include within your project? And will you be able to get enough of these particular patients within the timeframes you specify within the trial? And there's a difference between number of patients that might be there and number that will take part in the trial. And it may be that some additional PPI work will help to understand those that would be willing to take part in this particular trial that you're planning, or potentially be randomised into a trial. So there's quite a lot of work around understanding patient feasibility. Timelines is another thing. So making sure that you map out what's needed across the timescale of the grant, that you allow adequate time to set up the study, adequate time to seek and get approvals, to recruit your patients, and then to think about follow-up time of patients, and importantly, the analysis section. We do often see projects where there's a feeling that you can start recruiting patients on day one of the grant, and the moment the last visit happens, the next day there's going to be a button pressed and there will be the results. And that's not the case. It takes time. It takes time to do it really well. And then there's the important element of actually interpreting those results and thinking about disseminating. Thinking through, again, the team track record. I mentioned that earlier, and showing that you can, as a team, develop and deliver a study. And if there are elements of this that are really unclear, it may be that you need to go back a stage and actually consider doing a feasibility study that looks specifically at these elements of uncertainty before you move to a full trial. And the funding doesn't, just because the trial stops doesn't mean the research stops, as it were. So thinking about impact that I mentioned earlier, making sure that you've engaged with the right stakeholders to ensure that the information from the trial, the results from the trial, can be shared rapidly and effectively with those that need to know to affect the maximum impact for the research. Every grant, every funder has a slightly different system and slightly different application form. So it's important that you understand that for the particular grant you're applying to, and make sure that you do include all the sections that they require. There's often large free text fields, but within that there's expectations about what's needed. You make sure that you do assert and then also justify why you've made a certain assertion. Be very, very clear about what your main messages are, and as needed, repeat those. If they're important, they should be repeated. Make sure that you do embrace the word count, but also leave some white space. Block text is never going to be a good thing. So making good use of the space within an application form can really help the reader. Being consistent with the terminology you use is helpful to anyone reading it, and also to not be overcomplicated in the way you convey particularly clinical messages, but at the same time avoid any informalities. It probably goes without saying that you should proofread, but it is surprising how many times, and I know myself, that you can read it a million times and there'll always be one or two typos somewhere. So it's always worth taking the time to properly proofread your application before it's submitted. All of this takes quite a lot of time. And it's important that you leave enough time to do this and to do this properly. We would say it takes a number of months to develop a really good application, and some bigger applications may take even longer. And leaving enough time to do that is really important. You also need to involve a number of different people. So I've talked a lot about the research team, but for clinical research, you'll need to have a sponsor. And for the most part, that is the substantive employer of the chief investigator or the principal investigator, but it may not always be. And you should never assume that you will get sponsorship from your organisation. You do need to go and investigate and apply often to get that confirmed. You may need to involve the insurance team and to get adequate insurance, particularly if what you're planning is maybe slightly more novel, and it's important that you include them. And most organisations will have a research office. They will help you with costing of applications, and some of the administrative side, and engaging with them early will be hugely helpful. And the Clinical Research Network, we're very, very lucky to have the Clinical Research Network in the UK, and they provide a lot of advice around some of the costing elements, around nurse provision at other centres, and engaging with them can be hugely beneficial. So this is just a little bit of a roadmap which kind of goes through some of the things I've been talking about. I think it's really important, this step 4, to have time to refine and craft your proposal. It's greater than just bringing it all together. It needs to then flow as a story and to be endorsed by the full team before it actually is submitted. And finally, I know that might sound all a little bit daunting, but we are, as a group, especially if you're working in cancer trials, here to help, and we can help you navigate through a number of those elements, well, all of those, and actually undertake some of the development work with you as well. So please don't feel too daunted, and do come and contact us. We are here to help.